Hunters hurt the little girl until the vampire king appeared behind them and said, "Enough." The silver blade carved through the child's shoulder, and her scream shattered the winter silence like breaking glass. But what made the three hunters freeze wasn't the blood that bloomed dark against her torn dress, or even the way her small body crumpled into the snow. It was the single word that came from behind them, spoken so softly it might have been a lover's whisper, yet carrying the weight of an executioner's pronouncement. Enough. Wait, before the next revelation happens. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To make sure you don't miss any unexpected alliances or awakened powers, subscribe and join our circle. The game is about to change. Now, back to the scene. The marketplace square of Blackstone Village had emptied an hour before sunset, as it always did when the hunters arrived. Merchants had shuttered their stalls, mothers had pulled their children indoors, and even the stray dogs had slunk into shadows. The fountain at the square's center, a stone monument to some forgotten saint, stood silent, its water frozen into jagged sculptures that caught the dying light. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her name was Ilara, though the hunters hadn't bothered to ask. They'd found her trying to steal bread from the baker's back door, her fingers blue with cold, her stomach hollow enough that her ribs showed through the thin fabric of her dress. The baker had called them, as was his duty. Any child without family, without papers, without explanation. These were the rules in the borderlands where human settlements pressed against territories no mortal was meant to traverse. Checking for the mark, the lead hunter had said, pulling the girl into the square by her hair. His name was Gareth, a bull of a man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had stopped seeing people years ago. He saw only potential threats, possible infections, vessels that might carry the corruption of the night. The other two hunters, a wiry man called Finn and a woman whose scarred hand suggested she'd survived something she shouldn't have, had formed a triangle around the girl. They'd stripped away her threadbare cloak despite her whimpers, searching her pale skin for any sign of a bite, any trace of the curse that turned men into monsters. "Please," Ilara had whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that swept through the square. "I'm just hungry. I'm not one of them." "They all say that," Finn had replied, almost bored. He'd drawn his silver dagger, holy silver, blessed by priests in tempered and sanctified water. The blade itself was meant to burn any creature touched by darkness. It was also their favorite tool for testing. When they'd pressed it against her skin, Ilara had screamed. Not because the silver burned. It didn't, because she was human, just a starving orphan in the wrong place at the wrong time. But because Gareth had pressed too hard, eager to prove his thoroughness to any watching villagers. The blade had cut deep, slicing through the thin flesh of her shoulder. That was when the temperature dropped. Not gradually, not in the natural way of winter evenings in the borderlands. The cold came like a wall, like stepping from a warm room into an ice cavern. Breath became visible fog. The frozen fountain cracked with a sound like thunder. And the three hunters, who had faced vampires and werewolves and things that had no names in mortal tongues, felt something they'd trained themselves never to feel: fear. The man, if he could be called that, stood behind them as though he'd always been there, as though reality had simply forgotten to include him until this precise moment, and now corrected its error. He was tall, but that seemed an inadequate word. He didn't merely occupy space, he dominated it, bent it, made everything else seem somehow smaller by comparison. His coat was black and swept nearly to the ground, cut from fabric that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His hair fell past his shoulders, dark as a raven's wing, framing a face that would have been beautiful if not for the absolute absence of anything resembling human warmth. His eyes were silver, not gray, not blue-tinged, silver, like molten metal, like the blade that had just cut the child. "Enough," he repeated, and this time there was no mistaking the command in it. Gareth recovered first, because Gareth had survived by never hesitating. He spun, blade rising, already calculating the strike that would take this stranger's head from his shoulders. He'd killed 7 vampires in his career, 7 creatures faster and stronger than any human. He knew the techniques, knew the weaknesses. He didn't even see the Vampire King move. One moment, Gareth was mid-strike, silver blade aimed at the stranger's throat. The next, he was on his knees, his own dagger pressed against his jugular, held there by fingers that looked slender and refined, but were absolutely immovable. "Drop your weapons," the stranger said. His voice carried the faintest accent, something old and Eastern European, vowels shaped by a tongue that had learned language when English was still forming. "Step away from the child. If you obey quickly, you may live long enough to regret what you've done here." Finn and the scarred woman didn't move. They'd hunters. They'd dedicated their lives to fighting monsters. Retreat wasn't in their vocabulary. "Lord Theron," Finn breathed, recognition dawning like a death sentence. The Vampire King, for that's what he was, what he'd always been, smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. How gratifying to be remembered. Though I note you haven't yet dropped your weapons. "Shall I assume you're volunteering for a demonstration?" Ilara, bleeding in the snow, turned her head just enough to see what was happening. Through the haze of pain and fear, she watched the monster, for what else could he be, hold her tormentor with no more effort than one might restrain a child. She'd heard the stories, the warnings whispered by the village women. Vampires were evil. Vampires were death. Vampires took children in the night and drained them until nothing remained but husks. But this vampire had said enough. "The Covenant," the scarred woman said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "You can't harm hunters in human settlements. The treaty—" "The treaty," Theron interrupted, "specifies that my kind may not hunt in protected territories. It says nothing about my ability to stop humans from torturing a child in the street like animals. Unless you'd like to argue that this," he gestured with his free hand toward Ilara, "falls within the acceptable parameters of your mandate." "She's a potential risk," Gareth choked out, the silver blade still pressed against his throat. A thin line of blood appeared where it touched his skin. "We were following protocol." "Your protocol," Theron said softly, "is barbarism dressed in bureaucracy. How many children have you tested this year, Hunter Gareth? How many have you carved open in the name of safety?" Silence answered him. "I see." Theron's grip loosened, just slightly. "Then allow me to establish a new protocol. From this moment forward, any hunter who draws a blade on a child in my territory will answer to me personally. I suggest you inform your guild." "This isn't your territory," Finn said. "This is Blackstone Village, human land, protected by—" "By what?" Theron's voice cracked like a whip. "By the Crown? The same Crown that abandoned these border settlements 3 winters ago when the tax collectors stopped coming? The same authority that left you to fend for yourselves against the creatures that walk the night? He released Gareth, who stumbled backward, clutching his throat. You exist here because I allow it. Because the alternative, a true war between our kinds, would leave these lands soaked in blood for generations. Don't mistake practical tolerance for weakness. He moved then, crossing the space to Elara in 3 strides. The hunters tensed, weapons rising despite their fear, because this was it. This was the moment the monster revealed his true nature. He would take the girl. He would drink her. Everything they'd said about the bloodsuckers would be proven true. Theron knelt in the snow beside Elara. Up close, she could see that his skin was too pale, too perfect, unmarred by weather or time. She could see that he didn't breathe, didn't blink at the frequency humans did. She could see that he was something else, something other. Something that shouldn't exist in the waking world. "Child," he said gently, "what is your name?" She tried to answer, but the pain in her shoulder had spread into her arm, her chest, her throat. The world was getting darker, colder, more distant. "Elara," she finally managed. "My name is Elara." Elara. He spoke it like a prayer, like an oath. "I am going to touch your wound. It will hurt, but only for a moment. Then it will stop hurting altogether. Do you trust me?" It was an absurd question. She didn't know him. He was a vampire, a creature of nightmare. She should be screaming, should be trying to crawl away. But he'd said enough. "Yes," she whispered. Theron's hand moved to her shoulder, covering the wound. His palm was cold, impossibly cold, but not unpleasant. It felt like ice water on a burn, shocking but ultimately soothing. Then came the pain had promised, a sharp spike that made her gasp, made her vision go white. But it passed in seconds, replaced by a tingling warmth that spread from the wound outward. When he removed his hand, the cut was gone. Not healed, gone, as if it had never existed. Even the blood that had stained her dress had vanished, leaving only the tear in the fabric as evidence of what had occurred. "How?" Elara started, but Theron was already standing, already turning back to the hunters who stood frozen in their triangle formation. "She's human," he said flatly, "completely, thoroughly human. No trace of any curse, any infection, any transformation. She's a child who was starving, who tried to steal food to survive, and you tortured her for the crime of being desperate." He let the words hang in the frozen air. "Go back to your guild hall. Tell them what happened here. Tell them that Lord Theron Darkholme has extended his protection over Blackstone Village and its inhabitants. All of them. Especially those you would mark as suspicious simply because they're young and alone." "You can't," Gareth began. "I can. I have. The question is whether you're foolish enough to test that claim further tonight." Theron's eyes flashed, catching the last rays of dying sunlight, transforming them into something that burned like cold fire. "Choose quickly. My patience, unlike my existence, is not infinite." The hunters chose retreat. They gathered their weapons, exchanged looks that promised this conversation wasn't over, and backed away from the square. Within moments, they'd vanished into the narrow streets that led toward the village's fortified guild hall. Theron and Elara were alone in the square. The child had pulled herself into a sitting position, her back against the frozen fountain, her mind trying to process what had just happened. The vampire who had saved her. The vampire who had healed her. The vampire who now stood looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Why?" she asked. It was the only question that mattered. Theron was quiet for a long moment. In the distance, lamps were being lit in windows. The village was stirring again, emerging from its collective holding of breath. Soon there would be questions, accusations, possibly violence. A vampire in the square. A vampire who had touched a child. The rumors would spread like plague. "Because someone should have said it sooner," he finally answered. "Enough. Someone should have said it when they first adopted these brutal testing methods. Someone should have said it when they began treating every orphan, every stranger, every person without proper documentation as a potential monster." He looked toward the darkening sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. "I have lived for 6 centuries, child. I have seen horrors that would break your mind to witness. But tonight, watching those hunters cut you simply because they could, because their fear had been weaponized into policy? Enough." Elara struggled to her feet. Her legs were shaky, her body still processing the trauma, even though the wound was gone. What happens now? Now? Theron turned back to her, and something almost like sadness flickered across his ancient features. "Now you face a choice. The villagers will fear you after this. They'll say you're tainted, cursed, marked by my intervention. The hunters will watch you, waiting for any sign that their suspicions were justified. You could try to stay, try to prove your humanity, but it will be a hard road. And the other choice? You come with me." He said it simply, without ceremony or pretension. "I have an estate 3 miles north, beyond the border stones. It's safe, warm, and I can promise you'll never go hungry again. You would be under my protection, true protection, not the hollow promise of some distant crown." "You're a vampire," Elara said. "Yes, vampires drink blood. Yes, vampires kill people. Some do." Theron's expression didn't change. "Some humans kill people as well. Some torture children in public squares. The capacity for evil isn't bound by species, Elara. It's bound by choice." She looked back toward the village, toward the buildings that had never been her home, filled with people who had never been her family. The baker who had called the hunters instead of simply asking her to leave. The merchants who had looked past her as though she were invisible. The mothers who had pulled their children away when she approached, as if poverty were contagious. "If I come with you," she said slowly, "will you teach me?" "Teach you what?" "How to make them say enough." She met his silver eyes with her own hazel ones, and there was something in her gaze that made even the Vampire King pause. How to make the monsters, the real monsters, stop. Theron studied her for a long moment. Then, for the first time that evening, he smiled. Not the predatory expression he'd shown the hunters, but something genuine. Something that suggested he'd just heard the most interesting thing anyone had said to him in decades. "I think," he said, "that could be arranged." He offered his hand. It was cold, pale, belonging to a creature that shouldn't exist according to every law of nature. But Elara had learned something important tonight. Sometimes the monsters weren't the ones with fangs. She took his hand. Together, they walked out of Blackstone Village, leaving behind the frozen fountain, the scattered drops of blood that were already being covered by fresh snow, and a community that would spend years arguing about what had really happened in the square that night. Behind them, hidden in the shadows of the Guildhall, Gareth watched them go. His hand moved to his throat, where the silver blade had drawn blood. Where the Vampire King had held him as easily as one might restrain a kitten. "This isn't over," he muttered. But he was wrong. One thing had ended tonight in that square. And something else, something unprecedented, something dangerous, something that would reshape the border between human and immortal, had begun. 3 weeks later, Ilara sat in a library that contained more books than she'd known existed in the entire world. The estate Theron called home was a sprawling manor built into the side of a mountain, half carved from living stone, half constructed from materials that predated modern architecture. It was a place of contradictions, ancient and maintained, dark and somehow welcoming, dangerous and absolutely safe. She'd been given her own room, a space larger than any dwelling she'd ever inhabited, with a bed that felt like sleeping on clouds, and a window that overlooked a forest of perpetual twilight. She'd been given clothes that fit, food that never ran out, and most importantly, answers to questions she'd never been allowed to ask. The manor wasn't empty. Theron had a household staff of 12, all human, all paid fairly, all free to leave whenever they wished. A woman named Margaret, who'd been a seamstress before her village burned, managed the domestic affairs. A man named Robert, who'd been a scholar until his university branded him a heretic for his research, maintained the library. Others came and went. A blacksmith, a gardener, a cook whose pastries made Ilara want to weep with joy. None of them feared Theron. They respected him, certainly. Some even seemed to genuinely like him. But there was no terror, no sense of being prisoners in a monster's lair. It's simple economics, Robert explained when Ilara asked about it. He was teaching her to read, a skill she'd never had the opportunity to learn. Lord Theron doesn't need many servants. He doesn't eat, doesn't produce waste in the traditional sense, doesn't require the sort of constant attention that a human lord would. But he values knowledge, order, and competence. He pays us 3 times what we'd earn anywhere else and asks only that we be discreet about his nature. And the blood? Ilara asked. She'd been in the manor for 3 weeks and hadn't seen Theron feed once. Robert's expression grew more serious. He feeds, but not here. Never from anyone in the household. That's the unbreakable rule. He goes into the deeper territories where the truly dangerous creatures live. Rogue vampires, blood-mad newborns, things that have lost whatever humanity they once possessed. He feeds on the predators, the ones who would hunt us otherwise. He eats monsters. In a manner of speaking, yes. It should have been reassuring. Instead, it made Ilara's mind spin with questions. What was Theron, really? Why did he maintain a human household? Why had he intervened in the square that night? Why offer protection to a starving orphan he'd never met? She found him in the portrait gallery, a long hallway lined with paintings that spanned centuries. Some were masterworks, others were crude but clearly precious for personal reasons. He stood before one in particular, a portrait of a young woman in medieval dress, her smile captured in oils that had somehow retained their vibrancy through the centuries. Her name was Catherine, Theron said without turning. He'd known she was there, of course. Vampires always knew. My wife, when I was human. We were married for 3 years before the plague took her. I was 26 years old. Ilara moved to stand beside him, looking up at the painting. The woman was beautiful, but it was her eyes that captured attention. Intelligent, kind, seeing the painter and seeing through him simultaneously. You loved her, Ilara said. More than I knew it was possible to love anyone. His voice was soft, distant, speaking across centuries. When she died, I made terrible choices. I sought out the darkness, thinking it would end my pain. Instead, it transformed me into what I am. Immortal, powerful, and utterly alone. You're not alone now, no. He finally looked away from the portrait, down at the child beside him. I spent 3 centuries being what everyone feared I was. I hunted, killed, built an empire of terror across Eastern Europe. I was the nightmare parents whispered about to make children behave. I was exactly what the hunters claim all vampires are. What changed? Theron's smile was bitter. I got bored. Centuries of the same pattern: hunt, feed, kill, survive. I began to remember Catherine, remember what it felt like to be human, to care about something beyond the next meal. I started to wonder if immortality was a gift or a curse, and I realized the answer was entirely dependent on what I chose to do with it. He turned fully toward her, kneeling so they were at eye level. I saw you in that square, bleeding in the snow, and I saw every child who'd ever been a victim of fear and ignorance. I saw every innocent person killed because they were different, or poor, or simply in the wrong place. And I thought, enough. If I'm going to exist for eternity, let it be as something other than another source of terror. Why me, though? Ilara persisted. There must be other children in trouble, other people who need help. Why did you offer to take me in? Because you asked the right question. His silver eyes held hers. When I offered you a choice, you didn't ask if I would hurt you. You didn't ask if I could be trusted. You asked if I would teach you how to make monsters stop. That told me everything I needed to know about who you are, Ilara. What am I? Someone who understands that the world is broken and wants to learn how to fix it. Someone who doesn't waste time with fear when there's work to be done. He stood, offering his hand once again. Come, if you're serious about learning, we should begin. The training room was in the manor's lowest level, carved directly from the mountain stone. It was sparse, padded floors, practice weapons arranged on walls, targets set at varying distances. Theron had changed into simpler clothing, black trousers and a white shirt that somehow made him look both more and less human. "I'm not going to teach you to fight," he said, seeing her confusion. "Not yet. You're 7 years old. Your body isn't ready for serious combat training, and I won't warp your growth by forcing you into a soldier's regimen before you've had a chance to be a child." Then what? Observation. He moved to the center of the room. Fighting is the last resort of someone's failed at every other option. Before you learn to throw a punch, you need to learn to read a room, to understand who has power, who wants power, who's afraid, who's angry, who's lying. You need to learn to see the game before you can play it. He gestured toward the walls, where Ilara now noticed alcoves she'd missed before. In each one stood a figure. The members of the household staff, she realized. Margaret, Robert, the others, all standing perfectly still. "What do you see?" Theron asked. Ilara studied them. "People?" "Details, Ilara. Margaret, look at her hands. What do they tell you?" Ilara focused on the older woman's hands. They were scarred, the fingers slightly crooked. She works with her hands. The scarring is old, but the way she holds them, she's ready to grab something, like she's used to quick movements. Good. What does that suggest about her? She made things, but the way she stands, she's balanced, ready to move. Not just a seamstress. Maybe something that required quick reflexes? She sewed military uniforms on the front lines, Theron confirmed. The scars are from when her camp was raided and she fought off soldiers with the nearest weapon, her sewing scissors. She killed 3 men before they retreated. Ilara looked at Margaret with new eyes. The gentle woman who'd helped her pick out dresses, who made her cocoa in the evenings, had killed soldiers. "Everyone has depths," Theron said softly. "Everyone has a story that made them who they are. The hunters who cut you, they weren't born cruel. Something taught them to value security over compassion, to see threats in every shadow. Understanding that doesn't excuse them, but it helps you predict them. For the next hour, Theron walked Ilara through reading each person in the room. Robert, whose slight limp came from a beating he'd received when his research challenged church doctrine. Samuel, the blacksmith, whose massive frame hid a gentle soul that had been broken when his daughter died of fever. Anna, the cook, whose recipes were a connection to a homeland she could never return to after fleeing political persecution. Now, Theron said, apply the same observation to me. What do you see? Ilara studied him carefully. He stood in the center of the room with perfect posture, hands relaxed at his sides, expression neutral. But there were details, small things she'd never noticed before. You don't move unless you have to, she said slowly. Even when you walk, there's no wasted motion. Like every gesture costs something. What does that suggest? That you're very aware of your strength. That you're always controlling yourself, always holding back. Because if you didn't, she trailed off, understanding clicking into place. Because if you didn't, you could hurt people by accident. The world is more fragile than you are. Something flickered across Theron's face. Surprise, perhaps? Or recognition? Continue. You keep space between yourself and others. Not obviously, but you do. Even when you're talking to someone, you maintain distance. Margaret gets close to people when she talks. I've seen it. Robert leans in. You pull back. Why? Because you don't trust yourself completely. Or, no, because you don't want others to fear you more than they already do. You're trying to make yourself less threatening. And? Ilara thought hard. There was something else. Something in the way he looked at the staff, at her. You're lonely. Even with all these people around, you're alone. Because they're not like you. Because you know you'll watch them all grow old and die, and then you'll still be here. The silence that followed was profound. The staff members in their alcoves remained perfectly still. This was obviously a training exercise they'd participated in before, but there was a quality to their stillness now that suggested they were listening intently. Remarkable, Theron finally said. His voice carried notes she couldn't quite identify. 3 weeks. You've been here 3 weeks, and you've understood what some people never grasp in a lifetime. Is it true, what I said? Every word. He moved closer, breaking his own rule about distance. Yes, Ilara, I am lonely. Yes, I hold myself apart because the alternative is watching everyone I care about vanish like morning frost. Yes, I control every movement because the strength in my little finger could snap a human spine. And yes, that is precisely why I need to teach you these skills. I don't understand. Because someone needs to learn to see the world this way. Someone needs to be able to read the truth behind the masks people wear. The hunters are afraid, so they hurt others. The nobility hoards power because they fear losing it. The church condemns what it doesn't understand because ignorance is terrifying. He placed a hand on her shoulder, the same shoulder he'd healed weeks ago. I can protect you, Ilara. I can teach you to protect yourself. But more importantly, I can teach you to see when protection is needed and when the real danger is from those who claim to offer it. Over the following weeks, the lessons continued. Theron brought visitors to the manor, carefully vetted contacts from the various communities that existed in the border territories. Ilara watched him negotiate with a werewolf pack leader, observed him diffuse a potentially violent confrontation between human merchants and a coven of witches, learned to recognize the signs of genuine threat versus posturing. "Why do they all come to you?" she asked one evening after a particularly tense meeting between 3 different supernatural factions, all claiming territorial rights to the same forest. "Because I don't have a stake in their conflicts," Theron explained. They were in his study, a room lined with books and maps that documented the shifting landscape of power in the border territories. I'm old enough that I've outlived grudges, powerful enough that I can enforce agreements. But most importantly, I genuinely don't care who controls what patch of forest or which hunting ground belongs to whom. I care that they don't go to war, because war in the borderlands always results in human casualties, which brings the hunters, which escalates everything. You're trying to keep peace. I'm trying to keep everyone alive long enough that they might learn to coexist. Not the same thing, but it's a start. Ilara processed this. The hunters don't see it that way. No. To them, I'm a vampire lord expanding my influence. They're not entirely wrong. I am expanding my influence. But my goal isn't domination. It's survival. For everyone. Even the hunters? Farron's laugh was humorless. Especially the hunters. They're the most endangered of us all, though they don't realize it. They operate on fear and doctrine, which makes them predictable. Predictable enemies are manageable. But if they continue their current trajectory, treating every outsider as a threat, torturing children to test for corruption, they'll eventually provoke exactly the war they claim to be preventing. He pulled out a map, spreading it across his desk. Ilara had learned to read maps in recent weeks, could now identify the major settlements, the territorial boundaries, the places marked with symbols that indicated danger. "Look here," Theron said, pointing to a cluster of marks near the western edge of the borderlands. 3 vampire attacks in 2 months, all rogue newborns, recently turned, not yet in control of their hunger. The hunters respond by locking down human settlements, implementing harsh testing procedures, making life miserable for anyone who can't prove their lineage going back 3 generations. Which makes people desperate, Ilara said, following the logic. Which makes them more likely to take risks, venture into dangerous territories, become victims. Exactly. The hunter's solution creates more of the problem they're trying to solve. It's a cycle that will eventually consume everything. So we break the cycle. We try. Theron looked at her seriously. But understand, Ilara, breaking cycles is dangerous work. The hunters have their doctrine, the vampires have their traditions, the werewolves have their laws, the witches their codes. Everyone has a system they believe in, and anyone who challenges that system becomes a threat to all sides. You're saying we'll have enemies everywhere? I'm saying we'll have people who misunderstand our intentions everywhere. Whether they become enemies depends on how carefully we act. He rolled up the map. Which is why you're learning to observe, to read situations, to understand motivations. You can't change people's minds with force, but if you can show them a better option, demonstrate that coexistence is possible, sometimes that's enough. 6 months passed. Spring came to the borderlands, transforming the frozen wasteland into something almost beautiful. Flowers bloomed in defiance of the harsh soil. Birds returned from southern migrations. The forest around Theron's estate filled with life. Ilara was 8 now, taller, stronger, but more importantly, sharper. Her lessons had expanded beyond simple observation. Robert taught her history, not the sanitized version taught in human schools, but the real, complex story of how the supernatural and human worlds had collided, merged, and separated repeatedly over centuries. Margaret taught her etiquette and the subtle art of reading social situations. Samuel taught her the value of hard work and attention to detail. And Theron taught her everything else. She learned languages, Latin for understanding old texts, Romanian for communicating with Eastern covens, the gestural language used by werewolves when in beast form. She learned politics, the tangled web of alliances and grudges that governed the borderlands. She learned basic healing, enough to treat wounds without magic. She learned the geography of power, where to step and where to avoid. But most importantly, she learned to question everything. "Why do vampires burn in sunlight?" Theron asked her one morning. "Because they're creatures of darkness," she answered automatically, reciting what she'd heard all her life. Wrong. Try again. Ilara thought harder. "Because something in their transformation makes them vulnerable to UV radiation?" Better, but still accepting the premise. Try one more time. She stared at him, confused. "You do burn in sunlight. I've seen the precautions you take at dawn and dusk." "Yes, I burn. But why do I burn? Is it inherent to vampirism, or is it a limitation of the method by which I was turned?" He moved to the window, staying carefully in the shadow. "There are vampires in the southern territories who walk in daylight. Not comfortably, not without cost, but they manage it." Their turning was different. Their curse, or gift, depending on perspective, was administered by different means. So the burning is what? A side effect? It's a design feature. The vampire who turned me, an ancient creature named Corvinus, believed that vampires should be creatures of night, that darkness should be our domain. So when he shared his blood, he included that limitation deliberately. It became part of what we are. Ilara's mind raced. Then it could be changed? Theoretically. Though no one has successfully done so in the 3 centuries I've been searching. The point, however, isn't whether it can be changed. The point is that you should always question the assumed rules. Every truth about supernatural creatures, every law that governs our existence, these were choices made by someone, sometime, for some reason. Understanding the origin of a rule tells you whether it's truly immutable or simply traditional. This philosophy extended to everything. When they studied Hunter doctrine, Theron encouraged her to find the logic in it, even when she disagreed. When they analyzed supernatural hierarchies, she learned to see both the power structures and the vulnerabilities they created. When they discussed human politics, she was taught to separate what people claimed to want from what they actually needed. It was exhausting. It was exhilarating. It was the education no normal child could ever receive. And it was preparing her for something, though Theron wouldn't say what. The answer came on a humid summer evening when a messenger arrived at the manor gates. He was young, barely 16, wearing the gray cloak of a neutral courier, someone paid to carry messages between parties who couldn't or wouldn't communicate directly. "For Lord Theron Darkholme," the boy said, handing over a sealed envelope. "From the Hunters Guild of Blackstone Village. No reply required." Theron took the envelope, studied the seal, and dismissed the courier with a generous payment. Then he stood in the foyer, holding the message without opening it, his expression unreadable.
"It's about me,"
Ilara said. She'd learned to read him over the past months. "They haven't forgotten." No, they never forget. He broke the seal, scanned the contents, and sighed, a purely habitual gesture, since he didn't need to breathe. "They're demanding a formal investigation. They want to examine you, verify that you haven't been turned, ensure that my protection isn't a cover for corruption."
"Let them come."
"It's not that simple." Theron handed her the letter. "They're invoking the Covenant, the treaty that governs human supernatural relations in the Borderlands. According to its terms, they have the right to inspect any human living in supernatural territory to verify their status. If I refuse, it's considered a violation. If I allow it, and they determine you've been compromised in any way—"
"They'll kill me."
"They'll try." His voice was cold. "Which would force me to respond, which would break the covenant from my side, which would justify a full-scale hunter mobilization against every supernatural community in the region. We'd have war." Ilara read the letter carefully. It was formal, legalistic, carefully worded to give no room for negotiation. The hunters were making a power play, using her as the excuse. Either Theron backed down, appearing weak to both human and supernatural communities, or he refused and gave them justification for aggression.
There's a third option.
She said slowly.
Which is?
I go to them willingly. I present myself for their inspection. Let them verify that I'm human and unharmed. I give them exactly what they're asking for, which removes their justification for escalation.
Absolutely not.
Theron's response was immediate and absolute. You're a child. I won't send you into the Hunters Guild Hall alone.
Then come with me.
Under the terms of the Covenant, you have the right to escort anyone under your protection, don't you? He stared at her. You've been studying the Covenant. Robert thought I should understand the legal frameworks. He's very thorough. She met Theron's silver eyes with determination. This is what you've been training me for, isn't it? Not fighting, not magic, politics. Navigating conflict without violence. Showing both sides that coexistence is possible. You're 8 years old. I'm 8 years old and I've lived in a vampire's manor for 6 months without being harmed, corrupted, or turned. I'm proof that everything the hunters fear isn't inevitable. I'm proof that supernatural creatures can be something other than monsters. She held up the letter. They're expecting you to refuse, to show aggression, to confirm every assumption they have about vampires. What if we don't? What if we do exactly what they ask, calmly and cooperatively? Theron was silent for a long moment. She could see the calculations running behind his eyes, the assessment of risks and possibilities. If we do this, he finally said, if we go to Blackstone Village and submit to their inspection, you need to understand the danger. These are not rational people operating from a place of reason. These are frightened humans who have weaponized their fear. One wrong word, one perceived threat, and they will kill you before I can stop them. I know. Do you? Do you truly understand what I'm saying? I am fast, Elara. I am strong beyond human measure. But I am one being, and there will be a dozen hunters in that hall, all armed with weapons designed specifically to kill creatures like me. If they decide you're a threat, if they choose to see corruption where there is none, I cannot protect you and survive the encounter. We will both die. Then we'll have to convince them, Elara said simply. That's what you've been teaching me, isn't it? How to see people, understand them, show them alternatives to violence. Either that training means something, or it doesn't. She watched his expression shift through several emotions: pride, fear, resignation, determination. Finally, he nodded. Very well, but we do this properly. We send word that we're coming, arrive during daylight hours when they feel safest, and follow every protocol perfectly. We give them no excuse for aggression. Agreed. And Elara. He placed both hands on her shoulders, the gesture protective but also grounding. If anything goes wrong, if the situation becomes dangerous, I want you to run. Don't try to help me, don't try to negotiate, just run. The staff knows to expect you, knows to keep you safe. Promise me. She wanted to argue, to insist she wouldn't abandon him, but she'd learned when to concede strategic points. I promise. 3 days later, they set out for Blackstone Village. Theron had sent a formal response to the hunter's demand, stating that he and his ward would present themselves for inspection at noon on the summer solstice, a date heavy with symbolism, a time when supernatural creatures were traditionally at their weakest and human authority at its peak. The journey took most of the morning. They traveled on foot rather than by carriage, another deliberate choice. Carriages were associated with nobility, with power, with status. Walking suggested humility, accessibility, a willingness to meet as equals. As they crossed the border stones that marked the edge of Theron's territory and the beginning of human lands, Elara felt the subtle shift. It wasn't physical exactly, but it was real. A sense of leaving one jurisdiction and entering another. of moving from relative safety into potential threat. The village hadn't changed much since that winter night 6 months ago. The same buildings, the same narrow streets, the same fountain in the square where she'd bled in the snow. But the atmosphere was different. Word of their coming had spread. People lined the streets, watching in silence as the vampire lord and the child walked toward the Guildhall. Ilara searched their faces, applying the observational skills Theron had taught her. Fear, yes, that was universal, but also curiosity. Some expressions held anger, probably those who believed the hunter's narrative about corruption and danger. But others showed something more complex, uncertainty, perhaps even hope. "They're not sure what to think," she murmured to Theron. "Good," he replied quietly. "Uncertainty is the first step toward questioning assumptions." The Guildhall dominated the north side of the square, a stone building that had probably been a church in some earlier era. Its architecture was defensive, narrow windows, thick walls, a single reinforced door. The perfect headquarters for people who lived in constant expectation of attack. Gareth waited at the door, flanked by 6 other hunters. He wore formal guild regalia, leather armor reinforced with silver studs, the emblem of the Covenant stitched in silver thread over his heart. The other hunters were similarly equipped, each carrying at least 2 weapons visible, probably more concealed. "Lord Darkholme," Gareth said formally. His hand rested on his sword hilt, not quite threatening, but unmistakably ready. "You received our summons." "I received your request for inspection," Theron corrected gently. "And I've brought my ward, as invited, to demonstrate compliance with the Covenant's terms. Shall we proceed indoors, or would you prefer to conduct your examination in the square, where the entire village can witness?" It was a masterful move, Ilara realized. Public scrutiny would force the hunters to follow proper procedure, would make it harder for them to take liberties or manufacture evidence. Gareth clearly understood this too. His jaw tightened with frustration. "Indoors," he said curtly. "The Guildhall has proper facilities for inspection. Of course." Theron gestured for Ilara to proceed. As they moved toward the door, he added casually, "I trust your facilities comply with Covenant standards. Section 7, Article 3 specifies that inspections must be conducted by qualified physicians in the presence of witnesses from both parties. I've brought documentation of my rights as Ilara's guardian, should you need to review them." Garrett's expression suggested this was not going as he'd hoped. The other hunters exchanged glances. They'd expected resistance, threats, perhaps even violence that would justify retaliation. Instead, they were getting meticulous legal compliance. Inside, the Guildhall was exactly what Ilara had imagined: austere, functional, designed for purpose rather than comfort. The main room held training equipment, weapon racks, a large table covered with maps. But Gareth led them past this into a smaller chamber that was clearly meant for medical examinations. A woman waited there. Not one of the hunters from that night in the square, but someone older with the bearing of a physician. She wore simple clothing under a white coat, and her expression suggested professional detachment rather than prejudice. "Dr. Helena Morse," she introduced herself. "I've been contracted by the Guild to conduct the examination. Are you Ilara?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you understand why we're here? You're not being compelled or threatened?" Ilara glanced at Theron, who nodded permission to speak freely. "I understand. The hunters want to verify that I haven't been turned into a vampire and that Lord Darkholme hasn't harmed me. They're concerned because I've been living in his household for 6 months. And have you been harmed?" "No, ma'am. I've been fed, clothed, educated, and treated better than I was when I lived on the streets of this village." Dr. Morse's eyebrow rose slightly at that, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "Very well. If you'll sit here, I'll conduct the examination." "Lord Darkholme, you may remain as witness, but I must ask you to maintain distance." "Of course." Theron moved to the far corner of the room, hands clasped behind his back. every inch the picture of respectful cooperation. The examination was thorough, but not cruel. Dr. Morse checked Ilara's pulse, her reflexes, her breathing, all the vital signs that would be different in a vampire. She examined her skin for bite marks, checked her eyes for the telltale silver tint, even drew a small blood sample for testing. Throughout it all, Ilara remained calm, answering questions honestly. Yes, she'd been taught by Lord Darkholm's staff. Yes, she'd observed supernatural creatures. Yes, she'd been present during negotiations between different factions. No, she'd never been bidden. No, she'd never been forced to participate in anything uncomfortable. No, she had no desire to be turned. The shoulder wound, Dr. Morse said, examining the place where the silver blade had cut 6 months ago. There's no scar. How was it healed? Lord Darkholm placed his hand over it. The wound closed. Vampire blood? I don't know. He never explained the mechanism, only that it would hurt briefly and then heal. Dr. Morse made notes, her expression unreadable. Finally, she turned to Theron. I'll need to examine you as well. Standard procedure when inspecting a potentially influenced human. Of course. Theron moved to the examination table with the same calm compliance he'd shown throughout. The examination of a vampire was different. Dr. Morse used silver implements to verify that he reacted appropriately, flinching but not burning, since it was just brief contact. She checked his eyes, his reflexes, took blood that was darker and slower than human blood, but otherwise normal for his kind. You are old, she observed. Very old, I'd guess. 6 centuries, give or take a few decades. And in 6 centuries, you've never turned a child? I have turned exactly 3 people into vampires, Doctor. The first was a mistake. I was newly turned myself and didn't understand the consequences. The second was a mercy, a dying soldier who begged for more time to complete his mission. The third was a strategic alliance that I regret. Theron's voice was level, factual. I have never turned a child. The idea is abhorrent. Why? Because children deserve to grow, to change, to discover who they become. Vampirism freezes you at the moment of turning. A child turned remains a child forever, physically, hormonally, developmentally trapped in a body that can never mature. It's not immortality, it's imprisonment. Dr. Morse studied him for a long moment. You understand this is highly unusual. Most vampires I've encountered show no such moral consideration. Most vampires you've encountered are likely young, still drunk on their new power, not yet weathered by the reality of eternity. Give them a few centuries, some learn, others don't, which is why hunters exist, an unfortunate necessity when my kind failed to police ourselves. The examination concluded. Dr. Morse compiled her notes, then addressed both Gareth and Theron with equal formality. My findings are conclusive. The child is fully human. No trace of vampirism, no signs of blood thrall, no evidence of physical or psychological harm beyond the original wound inflicted by hunters 6 months ago, which has healed cleanly. Her vital signs are normal, her mental state is sound, and she shows no indication of being under supernatural influence. Gareth's face darkened. She's been living with a vampire. Yes, as have many humans throughout history. Living with a supernatural being does not automatically constitute corruption. According to the Covenant, grounds for removal require evidence of harm, coercion, or transformation. I find none of these. She defends him. She speaks favorably of someone who has provided her with shelter, education, and safety. That's not defense. That's gratitude. Unless you're suggesting gratitude towards supernatural beings is itself evidence of corruption, in which case I'd question the logical foundation of your position. Ilara watched the exchange with fascination. Dr. Morse was playing the same game Theron did. using logic, procedure, and careful language to dismantle opposition without ever raising her voice. The Guild's position, Gareth said stiffly, is that children should not be exposed to supernatural influences. It's a matter of public safety. The Guild's position, Theron interjected, his voice still soft but carrying an edge now, seems to be that poor children without family shouldn't exist at all. Because where was this concern for Ilara when she was starving on your streets? Where was this interest in her safety when your hunters cut her with silver to test a theory? That was protocol. That was brutality disguised as protocol. Theron took a step forward, and despite his calm demeanor, the hunters in the room visibly tensed. Let's be clear about what's happening here, Hunter Gareth. You demanded this inspection not because you care about Ilara's well-being, but because you want to prove that vampires are inherently corrupting, that I cannot possibly be providing genuine sanctuary. You wanted evidence to support your worldview. Instead, you've received medical documentation that contradicts your assumptions. You could have influenced the doctor, Finn said from his position by the door. Dr. Morse turned to him sharply. Excuse me? Are you questioning my professional integrity? I'm suggesting that a 6th-century-old vampire might have abilities we don't understand. Then you're suggesting I'm incompetent to detect such influence, which is insulting given that I've been examining potentially influenced humans for 2 decades. Would you like to file a formal complaint about my methodology? Because I assure you, my license is current and my techniques are approved by both the Medical Council and the Covenant Oversight Committee. The tension in the room escalated. Hunter's hands moved toward weapons. Theron remained perfectly still, but Ilara could sense the shift in him, the predator beneath the civilized veneer, calculating distances and threat levels. She stepped forward, inserting herself between Theron and the hunters. "Stop," she said, and something in her voice made everyone pause. "All of you. This is exactly what we're trying to prevent." "Ilara," Theron started. "No, let me speak." She turned to address Gareth directly, applying every lesson she'd learned about reading people, understanding motivations. "You're afraid. I understand that. You've dedicated your life to fighting monsters, and suddenly there's one who doesn't fit your definition. It's confusing. It makes you question whether the rules you followed are complete." "I'm not afraid of a child," Gareth said dismissively. "I'm not talking about being afraid of me. I'm talking about being afraid that you might be wrong, that maybe the black and white worldview you've built your entire identity around is more complicated than you thought." She gestured to Theron. "He's a vampire. That's true. Vampires have killed people, lots of people. Also true. But he personally has chosen not to. He's chosen to use his power differently. And that scares you, because if one vampire can choose differently, it means they all can, which means the ones who kill aren't doing it because they have to, they're doing it because they want to. And that makes them responsible, culpable. It removes the excuse of nature and replaces it with the question of choice. The room was silent. Every hunter stared at her, this 8-year-old child articulating what they'd probably felt but never voiced. "You want me to be corrupted," Ilara continued. "Because if I am, it proves vampires are evil, but I'm not. Dr. Morse has verified that. So now you have to face the uncomfortable reality that maybe, just maybe, the world is more complicated than your guild has taught you." "The Covenant exists for a reason," Gareth said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "The Covenant exists because humans and supernatural beings were killing each other constantly, and it needed to stop. It's a treaty of necessity, not morality. It doesn't say vampires are evil, it says vampires and humans need to stay separated to prevent conflict. But Lord Darkholme isn't violating that. He's living in his territory, maintaining his household, and intervening only when necessary to prevent violence, exactly what the Covenant allows. She took a breath, delivering her final point. You can hate him for being different, you can distrust him because of what he is, but you can't claim he's violated any law, harmed any human, or acted against the Covenant's terms. The only violation here was 6 months ago, when your hunters cut a child in a public square without cause, and he stopped it. That's all. Dr. Morse cleared her throat. The child makes a compelling argument. My examination is complete, and my findings are recorded. Unless the Guild has specific evidence of Covenant violation, not suspicion, not philosophical disagreement, but actual evidence, I see no grounds for further action. Gareth looked like he wanted to argue, wanted to find some loophole or technicality, but he was trapped by the same legal framework he'd tried to weaponize. The Covenant was clear, the medical evidence was clear, and now a child had articulated the logical flaws in his position in front of witnesses. "Well be watching," he finally said, directing the comment at Theron. "Any sign that she's been harmed, any indication of corruption, and we will respond with full Guild authority." "I would expect nothing less," Theron replied smoothly. "Vigilance is, after all, your purpose. I trust you'll apply that same vigilance to actual threats, rather than inventing them where they don't exist." They left the Guild Hall as they'd entered, calmly, formally, with perfect compliance with every protocol. But as they walked back through the square, Elara noticed the difference in how the villagers watched them. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with something else now. Uncertainty, yes, but also curiosity. And in some faces, something that might have been the beginning of respect. "You took a considerable risk," Farron said once they were beyond the border stones, back in territory where he could speak freely. "You taught me to read people. I read him. He needed someone to speak his own doubts out loud, give him permission to question without seeming weak in front of his hunters. And if you'd misread him? If he'd reacted with violence instead of contemplation? Then you would have protected me, and we would have had war, and this approach would have been proven wrong." Elara looked up at him. "But that's the risk, isn't it? Trying to change things without violence means accepting that violence might still find you. The alternative is to assume violence is inevitable and make it happen ourselves." Theron stopped walking. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. This 8-year-old child who somehow understood concepts that had taken him centuries to learn. "You are extraordinary," he said quietly. "Truly extraordinary. Catherine would have liked you." It was the highest compliment Elara had ever received, and she knew it. They walked the rest of the way back to the manor in comfortable silence, both aware that something significant had shifted, both uncertain what would come next. The aftermath of the inspection rippled through the borderlands like stone thrown into still water. Word spread that the hunters had examined the Vampire Lord's ward and found no corruption. That a child had challenged Hunter Gareth in his own hall and left unharmed. That perhaps, possibly, the absolute hostility between human and supernatural communities wasn't the only option. It started small. A merchant who'd been too afraid to trade in supernatural territories sent a tentative inquiry about buying herbs from a witch's garden. A werewolf pack that had been considering attacking a human settlement instead requested a meeting to discuss territorial boundaries. A coven that had been planning to curse a village for past persecution sent a messenger to discuss reparations instead. Theron's manor became an unofficial neutral ground. Parties who wouldn't meet anywhere else would come to his estate, conducting negotiations under his observation. It was exhausting work. Supernatural beings had long memories, and human grudges ran deep. But slowly, incrementally, the possibility of coexistence became visible. Ilara participated in it all. At first, she simply observed, sitting quietly in the corner during negotiations, learning to read the unspoken dynamics. But as weeks passed, parties began to direct questions to her specifically. She wasn't threatening like Theron. She was human, young, and somehow managed to articulate truths that adults had trouble expressing. "Why should we trust the wolves not to hunt our children?" a human village elder demanded during one particularly tense meeting. "Why should they trust you not to hunt theirs?" Ilara countered. "They have children too, cubs that play and learn and need protection. Both sides want the same thing, safety for their young. Maybe start there." It was naive, perhaps, simplistic, but sometimes the simple truth was exactly what was needed to cut through layers of historical complexity. The arrangement worked until the autumn equinox, when everything nearly fell apart.